Yo, how's it going guys? Nick here. And before we get started, I kind of want to talk about the video bit a little bit more. Just want to give like a little general roadmap, like a little walkthrough about this video. So there are about 35 general tips which don't have any gameplay, and about 65 character specific tips, most of which do have gameplay. Now I'm running on a time limited editing software, so I was limited in the amount of gameplay I was able to capture, so I just ended up putting a bunch of general gameplay. If you want to see more of me, more Nick Rick, feel free to check out my Twitch and join my Discord, both in the description below. I do coaching and VOD reviews for anyone who's interested. Any feedback or recommendations in the comment section below is much appreciated, as well as likes or subscriptions. Now without any further ado, let's get right into these tips. So, our first tip, tip number 1, is that bunny hopping is bad 99% of the time. So for those of you who don't know what it is, bunny hopping is basically the act of continuously spamming jumping. Bunny hopping puts you in an incredibly predictable movement pattern and leaves you very easy to shoot, so really try to refrain from doing it. If you really want to stop bunny hopping, I suggest unbinding your spacebar unbinding your jump for a few games just to get used to not jumping. Now, tip number 2 is that the game is generally broken into 6v6 team fights, or at least it should be. However, that's not always the case at lower ranks. Tip number 3. Learning when to save your ultimate in an overwhelmingly won fight, or like a completely lost fight, is huge. This honestly helped me so much. Like, don't waste your ultimate in like a 5v2, a 6v3 scenario where you're gonna win the fight, or in like a 3v5 where you have no chance of winning. Don't waste ultimates unless it's the last fight. Tip number 4. On your way back from spawn, call out the count for your team. Now, when I say the count, what I mean is how many people are alive on your team and how many people are alive for the enemy team. So let's say your team had 2 people die and the enemy team had 3 people die. That would be a 4v3. So on my way back from spawn, I'd be like, hey guys, there's a 4v3 right now, you got this. Tip number 5? Yes, tip number 5. Another thing you could do on your way back from spawn, or in between team fights, is holding tab to see what upcoming ultimates you guys have, and if the enemy makes any swaps. Tip number 6. When analyzing the enemy team comp, check to see if they have any verticality. If they only have a few characters with vertical mobility, feel free to abuse the high ground. Tip number 7. Playing high ground against snipers is tough, so don't be afraid to drop off if a sniper is eyeing you and forcing you off of your high ground. Plus, you should always kind of just keep track of this enemy sniper in general, because they're your main threat. Tip number 8. Don't use disengagement abilities to engage. Now, when I say disengagement abilities, I mean things like Reaper's Wraith Form, Moira's Fade, stuff like that. An enemy will notice, they'll hear the sound cue, they'll see all the, flash effects happening, and they'll think, oh, this Reaper doesn't have Wraith, that's an easy kill. So really refrain from using your abilities to engage, even though they give you a speed boost. Tip number 9. Learn your enemy's max damage potential. Now this is kind of complicated, and I kind of recently started doing it. I look at the enemy team comp, and I look at what has the highest burst damage at long range. So if the enemy has like 2 snipers in their comp, I'm going to be really careful around long lines of sight. But if they have, a really brawly comp like Reaper and Mei, I can kind of feel free to overextend a little bit and poke when I want to, without having too much pressure on me. Tip number 10. Really focus on not moving directly towards your goal in a straight line. Now when I say your goal, I mean it's a place you quickly want to move to. So let's say there's a health pack next to you, you're going to want to move next to that health pack. Your enemies are going to know this, and they're going to capitalize on your predictable movement if you just walk directly into it. They'll lead shots that way, they'll put, any explosive they can that way. So really try to not walk directly towards it, throw some strafing in there. Tip number 11. Always assume enemies have their abilities available, unless you hear a call out telling you it's down. Tip number 12. Capitalize on enemy abilities being down. Now I really wanted to make a video about this on its own, which I probably will do in the future, but taking advantage of an enemy lacking cooldown is one of the main things that help me climb. If I'm on a Rhine and the enemy Zarya doesn't have the team bubble for the Reinhardt, I'm generally going to play aggressive and bully the enemy Reinhardt. Alright, tip number 13. Don't take damage you don't have to. This is kind of most important for main tank, off tank, because you have such a large health pool, but if you're taking damage you don't have to, you're going to really be taking away your team's healing resources, and it might screw you for the long fight. Tip number 14. If you're close to a game-changing ult, say like 80% to Hanzo Dragons for your sick grab dragon combo, start focusing tanks to get your ultimate quicker. Tanks are a much easier shot, and you can often shoot them from a safe position. Tip number 15. It may seem incredibly obvious and cliche, but being positive, or at least not negative, really helps. Once I stopped being a bitch and stopped arguing in team chat every 3 seconds about who's carrying what, I started climbing. And I know it's really hard to believe that that's how it works. Tip number 16. People on the internet are trolls and will not hold logical debates. Don't allow yourself to get pulled into their negativity. Just mute them or ignore them. There's no point arguing because they're not going to listen to your logic, they're just going to hear what they want to say. So just mute and move on. Tip number 17. Duo queuing it's kind of always been the most effective way for me to climb, even since the console days. I always kind of thought that was because I used to run pharmacy, but even now that I play tanks and, I kind of just play tanks in general, duo queue is still amazing. Now, especially with the avoid system, you can easily avoid shitters on your team or the enemy team. Now, speaking of the avoid system, please, avoid people every game. Now, if you notice someone being toxic, getting picked first, you're just playing just shit in general, on either team, just avoid them. It's going to save you so much stress. Tip number 19. Don't hold the Grandmasters or higher ranked players on a pedestal. Now, I know it kind of contradicts my title, but you might honestly suffer from this. Just because I put GM in the title, you might think, oh, this person's opinion might matter. I'm still shit. Holding high ranked players on a pedestal is often the wrong thing to do. Sure, their opinion may hold more weight and they might play better than you generally, but that doesn't mean that you can't beat them or that everything they say is correct. Now, tip number 20, the final general tip for now, is don't freak out just because your team isn't 2-2-2 calm. Now, I know 2-2-2 might be ideal, but the way I see it, I'd rather have a good Hanzo than a bad Rhine, or like a bad off healer. Any game is winnable in my eyes as long as we have one healer and one tank. So 4 DPS comp, bring it on. Alright, so now on to the character specific tips. So starting off with Ana, going alphabetical order. Sometimes saving sleep dart is the right play, because if you waste it, enemies oftentimes going to get really aggressive on you. So if you save it, you might keep the enemy passive, keep them at bay, and be able to get easy shots on them. Now, the next tip for Ana it's kind of a big tip. It's learn to quickscope. Now, I'm not really great at it, as you can see in the gameplay, so I will recommend you guys to check out ML7 on YouTube. He has a really great guide. Alright, so the first Ashe tip is, generally I like to lead off fights with a dynamite onto an enemy healer, because hitting someone with dynamite will make them panic and probably bunny hop, which will cause them to be an easy hit. Now, the next Ashe tip is really simple. Just use your coach gun to get high ground really often. Alright, so the first tip of Bastion is that during your turret form and even your ultimate form, if you get pulse bombed, you still have enough health to live. Just note that if the Tracer burns a clip into you, you might want to start healing early, so that you can start repairing the damage done by the Tracer's left clicks. Now the next Bastion tip is honestly something I was really impressed with. I learned that Bastion has the third highest healing in the game, which is 75 per second. Alright, so the first tip for Brig is to try to get at least one left click or one left shift, which is your whip shot, off at least every 6 seconds. This will reactivate your passive, which heals for just about the same as Lucio. Small side note, your shield bash will not activate your passive. Alright, the next tip for Brig is to constantly look around for your main healer and make sure that they're doing okay, either by providing them armor packs or just generally peeling. Now, the first tip for Doomfist is kind of specific to Ana. So when you uppercut her in the air, she's unable to nade herself, because the nade can't explode on anything. Next Doomfist tip. Contrary to popular belief, the only ability for Doomfist that stuns is his right click. His seismic slam and uppercut do not actually stun. Alright, so the diva tips. When following a Winston on a dive, really prioritize eating Ana's sleep dart and her biotic nade. Those are the most two important cooldowns. The second diva tip, although Diva Bomb is often used as a zoning ult most of the time, it can still combo quite effectively with something like Genji Blade. All that added panic and pressure from the Diva Bomb can make your Genji's Blade so fat. And the final Diva tip is try your best to defense matrix any of your ulting teammates. Just like a Genji or a Pharah. These heroes will generally become large targets when they're ulting, so by you wasting defense matrix on them, you're often eating a ton of the enemy's cooldowns. Alright, the first tip for Genji is try not to use dash to engage on things like Winston or Mei, because deflect is useless against them and will leave you a sitting duck. Next tip is that a nanobladed slash and dash will deal more damage than trance can heal. Alright, so the first Hammond tip is that Hammond's ultimate kill combo is to swing above enemies, drop your mines mid-air, and then pile drive and knock the enemies up. They'll be suspended in air long enough for your mines to arm and explode. Next Hammond tip is that a nano boosted Hammond slam will deal 150 damage to anyone in the center of the circle, meaning you just need a melee and a few shots to kill a 200 HP target. Alright, so the final hammer tip is to watch for when you're engaging. Make sure that when you're engaging, you're not just feeding like blatantly. Make sure your tanks are able to engage with you and that your DPS are able to follow up on the insane amount of space you're creating. Alright, so the first tip for Hanzo is to make sure you're incorporating wall climbing into your movement as much as possible to make sure you're elusive. Now, the next Hanzo tip is to really focus on using your ultimate during the engagement, not too early, not like too late. So the biggest mistake I see Hanzo's doing is they'll fire off an ultimate before the fight, like before the enemy tanks are even engaged with your tanks, and they'll say, oh, it's just a zoning ultimate. Terrible. What you should really be doing is waiting until your tanks are engaged with the enemy tanks. This way your team could capitalize on the zoning and the separation caused by your dragons. Now the first Junkrat tip is to place a trap at your feet during a duel with a Genji. This way he thinks twice about dashing into you. Alright, the next tip for Junkrat is for his ultimate. So if you think your ultimate is not going to be able to get any kills because maybe you used it too early, the enemy still has like crucial abilities available, just try running it against the wall for 5 or 6 seconds. Maybe the enemy team gets aggressive. You know, maybe you just hold them back for 6 seconds and your team can capitalize on all that zoning. The next tip is that using a left click and then a mine will kill a squishy because they only have 200 HP and the combo deals 240. This is best used onto a squishy. Now, if you're going to use this on a squishy, make sure you're hitting your left click before your mine, because if you're using your mine beforehand, you're going to launch the enemy into the air and it's going to be really hard to hit. Now, the first tip for Lucio is to look at your team comp, and if you're the only person able to contest high ground, it's kind of your job to get enemy DPS off high ground. Best way to do so is to wall right up to them and boop them off. The next tip for Lucio is that if you know the enemy Sombra is about to engage with an EMP, try to stay really far away from your team so you don't get hit with it. This way you can still drop the beat and save your team. First tip for McCree is that High Noon has infinite range and no damage fall off, so you could pretend you're Widowmaker. The next tip for McCree is that using Fenna Hammer is now very viable, and it's super reliable for killing things like Brig and Doomfist. The next tip for Mei is that Mei's left click stacks with her ultimate, so if someone's in your ultimate and you left click them, they freeze twice as quickly. This is very useful for enemy Reinhardts who are about to charge out of it. Is that you could place a wall under your feet during a duel just to give yourself a temporary high ground. The final tip for Mei is that you can use a wall, kind of like a Roadhog hook, and separate somebody from the enemy team, and allow your team to get super aggressive onto them. This is very useful for Reinhardts at chokes like Volskaya point A and Hanamura point A. Similar to Lucio, you should use Valkyrie to contest enemies in high ground if your team is not able to. This also applies to killing Pharahs if your team is lacking damage for the Pharah. As Mercy, it's often worth it to heal someone through chip damage instead of going for a res and letting the person die to chip damage. As Moira, using your Fade will remove all debuffs like Discord, Anti-Heal, and Ash's Dynamite. Another tip for Moira is that right click and your purple orb can deal enough damage to pressure an enemy squishy and often be enough for you to win the duel. As Orisa, fortifying and letting an enemy Reinhardt charge you will deal no damage to you and often leave him in the middle of your team for a free pick. The biggest mistake I see lower ranked Orisas as well as Reins is putting their shield in the choke, when generally you want to have the shield a little bit behind the choke, so that way when you contest the cart, the enemy is stuck in the choke without much space available to let them move. When using Pharah's ultimate, you should always have a backdrop for her rockets, so this way the rockets that don't directly hit will still deal splash damage. The most often backdrop uses the floor, but a wall can still work. When hitting an enemy with a Pharah rocket, they're either going to move backwards or move closer towards their cover most of the time. Use this knowledge to your advantage and lead your rocket to their most likely position. Reaper's ultimate gets shut down by so many abilities, including stuns and shields, so try to use it once you know these certain abilities are either down or focus on someone else. If you're going to use Reaper's Shadow Step, make sure both point A and point B of your Shadow Step are out of all enemies' line of sight. Charging while the fight is fresh is almost never a good idea for Reinhardt. However, countercharging the enemy Reinhardt is almost always the right play, and calling out that you countercharge will often force your team to focus the downed enemy. A ton of Reins like to shatter while they're grabbed, so use this knowledge to your advantage. When you're playing Reinhardt, try to throw in a mixture of swings and shielding while the enemy Reinhardt is grabbed, being ready to block his shatter. Taking a breather while purple as Roadhog still provides damage reduction, so it can still be a valuable defensive tool. Roadhog is one of the strongest shield break characters in the game, so while your hook is down, try breaking shields instead of putting little bits of chip damage into other squishies. Against other 200 HP targets, try dealing 80 damage or 5 bullets to the enemy before firing your helix. This will leave an enemy at 120 HP, which isn't enough to make them use defensive abilities, but is enough for one helix to kill them. The next soldier tip is that up close, the ideal combo is 3 shots, helix rocket, and then melee. This will deal 107 damage total, and since your bullets have enough spread, this is really easy to do. Hacking Reinhardt is often the most effective target for Sombra, but he's always not the easiest. When going for a hack on Rein, try your best to do it from a high ground where you won't easily be shot, and when the enemy's Zarya bubble is down. Another Sombra tip is that although EMPing a Zen might seem like a free kill, it oftentimes isn't if they also have a Brig, because rally armor plus the 50 HP from Zen that's remaining is 150 HP total, plus Sombra deals reduced damage to armor, so it's often not as free as a kill as it seems. So make sure the Zenyatta does not have rally armor before you EMP him. Unless of course you're just trying to stop his trance, then go for it. If you find yourself in close range near barriers, left clicking them will build your charge and constantly refill your clip. This is really useful against Orisas and Winston to become 180 DPS madman within seconds. Placing a TP behind the enemy squishy with a few turrets in it is known as teleport bombing. Use this tactic to surprise enemy Anas and Zens, and with one charge right click and maybe a melee for good measure, you should have yourself a free pick. They often will not hear the teleporter and won't turn around to react. One sim turret slows enemy movement by 30%, and this debuff stacks with each turret. Use this to make landing shots or tracking with your left click much easier. Alright, time for the one Torb tip. Your Torb ult can be defense matrix, deflected, and it does not go through barriers. Keep this in mind when you're trying to combo with Grav, and try putting it to the sides of your opponents. So, with Tracer, if you have 0 blinks available, it's often better to just AD strafe while you wait for your blink to come back, instead of walking directly towards cover and towards the health pack you so desperately need. Tracer, like many other heroes, does half damage to armor. To help burn through this armor on tanks like Reinhardt and Winston, pulse bomb them early and finish them with your pistols. Similar to many other heroes, enemies who are jumping and bunny hopping are the easiest for Widow to hit. Keep this in mind and shoot enemies as they're on the way down. Now, when you're in a Widow vs other sniper duel and you've been body shot, the enemy will see your name tag peek around the corner before you even peek, often alerting them to when you're going to peek. When diving someone as Winston, try jumping to the area you think they're going to retreat to. This will allow you to block their exit and cause them to panic. A surefire way to get slept by Ana is by bunny hopping 24/7. Make sure you're either bubble dancing or AD strafing really up close and personal so that enemy Ana has to make wide movements to sleep you. If you're going balls deep and know you're about to primal, let your healers know this so that they don't panic when they see you at critical health. It can help your teammates who actually need healing. Zarya's right click has the same exact projectile arc as her ultimate, so if you're not confident about aiming it, fire a right click beforehand to make sure your grab is going to hit where you want it to. Just be aware, because this makes it obvious that you're looking for a grab, so it might get eaten or deflected. If you're having trouble tracking someone, throw a right click at the enemy's left or right side and track them as they bounce to the opposite side. Using your bubble, either on yourself or on teammates, cleanses debuffs, so wiping off anti-heals and discords becomes super important, especially in a GOATS meta. Zenyatta has no footstep sound, however his right click sound is pretty loud, so keep this in mind if you're going for aggressive flanks. Before a fight, if everyone is full HP, pre-orb a squishy. 30 healing per second means a lot more to a squishy than to a tank. In a Rein vs Rein matchup, discording the enemy Rein is often the most important target, as he's the one taking the most damage. Alright, so now we're back to like more general tips. So starting off, don't flex unless you're comfortable. Like, don't force yourself onto a roll just because you think your team might need it just to get to 2-2-2. Now, I flex a lot because I'm comfortable on plenty of heroes, but if you're not comfortable on some heroes, don't force yourself to play it, even if it fits the team comp. Now, although it might seem deceptive when you're calling out an enemy as one health, or absolute, it's generally a good way to get people to focus on an enemy. Now, focus fire, even in like Grandmaster solo queue games, is still an issue, so maybe lying a little bit to get someone to focus it's still a positive thing, honestly. Next tip, if you're playing a flanker, really focus on the timing of your engagement. If you engage too early, the enemy is going to disengage, peel, come find you, kill you, and that's it. But if you engage too late, most of your team will be dead already, and the enemy can just focus you after they kill them. So really engage at the right times. Now another flanker tip, make sure you're engaging when enemy CC abilities are down, or focus on baiting them out. This can be really helpful and make your job a ton easier. So if you're playing something like Tracer or Genji, try not to engage until Brig uses her stun or McCree uses his. Next tip, certain abilities in the game will cause enemies to panic and miss their shots. You know, things like Mei's freeze, Moira's right click, and Winston's Tesla cannon. Now this isn't a rule, but a general guideline is that good positioning is a place where you can do your job effectively as well as stay safe. Next tip, if you're bad at ult tracking, assume enemies have their ultimate unless they died early in the previous fight or have used ult recently. Next tip, focus Zenyatta. This will either bait out his trance or straight up kill him, enabling your team to pop their ultimate stress-free. Focusing enemies with wider hitboxes is much better than enemies with tall hitboxes. Targets like McCree and Zenyatta are incredibly wide, while things like Widow she's very slim and harder to hit. So focus more on wider hitboxes. Next up is a console specific tip. If you struggle with tracking, I highly suggest you turn off aim assist for a month and get used to it. Once you turning it back on, tracking should be so much easier. PS. Playing slower sensitivity is better for tracking most people. To improve your PC aim, I highly suggest one-tricking an aim-dependent hero like Ash or McCree, as they really help with crosshair placement. Another way to improve aim is to play aim hero for maybe half an hour a day. I highly recommend the reflex mode. If you're like me, you'll be absolute trash at it when you start, but do not let this get you down. The whole point of it is improvement. If you're better than you were the previous day, you're doing well. Now armor in this game is kind of complicated, so I'll try my best to explain it. The way it works is by having each instance of damage for a maximum of 5 damage reduction per instance. Now in human terms, this means that beam weapons like Zarya's left click, pellet weapons like Roadhog shotgun, or fast firing weapons like Tracer and Sombra will deal half damage to armor, while characters with heavy single instance damage like snipers or Pharah will only have 5 damage removed per shot. Please, 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 never blame your team unless you're in a super high rank. Seriously. My logic is that if you were to put a pro player in your seat and they played your heroes, like let's say you're a support player and you put Custa in your platinum games, he'll be carrying those games even as support. Now, I'm not saying you're gonna be Custa, but you can always play better and you can always learn what you can do better. If you don't know what you're doing wrong, I do VOD reviews, and so do plenty of other people in the Overwatch University subreddit. Feel free to send yours in. Now my last and final tip is to have some confidence in yourself. Seriously. I feel like I gained a ton of confidence in myself after outplaying a few streamers, and the games past my peak became so much easier, even though I was kinda scared to play them. Honestly, hitting Grandmaster and getting confidence is what got me to make these videos, honestly. Alright, so there you have it, 101 tips. Now editing this video took way too long and was way too stressful because I was on a 7-day time limit thanks to the Adobe trial. So if you guys have any recommendations for video editing software, please let me know in the comment section down below, as well as any other feedback you guys had. Now, feel free to subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate it. I do plan on posting more YouTube videos. However, right now I mainly stream on Twitch, as I believe I mentioned earlier. So that'll be down in the description below, as well as my Discord, where if you guys want, you get your VODs reviewed, you can just chat with me, it's whatever. But anyway, that's the end of this video. I will see you later.